There's intellectual freedom, the ability to be independent or independently think apart from our inherited beliefs and our ideologies. There's moral freedom, is there not? The ability to choose and to cultivate a noble and wholesome way of living within a civil community. There's material freedom, the availability, hopefully the abundance, of the conditions, resources that to live a healthy and wholesome and meaningful life. And of course, most importantly of all, there is, from Gandhi's point of view, certainly spiritual freedom, the ability to progressively realize the divine potential within the human. All of these are significant aspects, dimensions of freedom, layers, if you will. But one thing that seems to be very, very important is that it's important to appreciate the fact that every form of freedom, from the intellectual through the moral, the material, and the spiritual, in some critical sense, has to be earned. And it has to be sustained by human effort, human striving, and human suffering. Actually, that's simply to say an elementary truth about any form of freedom. We can also likewise, I think, ask the question meaningfully, well, what is meant? What could be meant? What can we understand by fostering human fellowship? Well, clearly, no human being, no individual, whether in a village or in a metropolis, is going to be able to actualize freedom of any kind in any meaningful sense, except within a culture, a community, a living matrix of relationships that are evolving and devolving. Reciprocally, no community, no society can progress without at least a certain proportion within its culture and its community of individuals who exemplify something of a higher form of life, something that's nobler, something that's inspiring, something that in some sense is contagious, it can be spread, that can be emulated. So these two, freedom and fellowship, are intimately related. Beautifully, complexly, like a wonderful dance, you might say, like a ballet, in which there's a wonderful harmonizing of music and movement, of grace, and also times of passion, times of drama, times of the music ebbing and flowing. This is true about human life. Well, if this is the case, what is it then that allows us to bridge the individual and the community to foster the individual? From Gandhi's perspective, the overarching principles that every human being should live and breathe is a love of truth and a willingness to engage in nonviolent action. These are the architectural principles that vitalize, revolutionize, regenerate any human being and any culture in their reciprocal relationships. Now, what is interesting when one has the opportunity to read Gandhi over a lifetime, and as I expressed to a wonderful questioner here earlier, I'm certainly no scholar on Gandhi. I do it, as Jerry said, to refresh, to gain new perspectives and a fresh sense of humility before the incredible challenge that we all face. But when one contemplates, so to speak, Gandhi's contribution, you realize that he's echoing something that we find by many spiritual teachers and many actually utopian reformers. What is that? The greatest freedom that's at the core of all the other freedoms that we enunciated is freedom from the tyranny of the self, the tyranny of the ambitious, competitive, exploitative, self-imposing, self-assertive self. If we can free ourselves from that, by trying the best that we can to embody in relevant ways our notions of what is true and what is helpful, what is genuinely harmonizing and uplifting, then it's possible, according to Gandhi and by his example and that of many, many, many others, is that it releases a kind of magnanimous self, a self that genuinely enjoys looking through many different lenses, looking through being able to sympathize with many human conditions, and therefore enriches and is enriched by the examples and the lives of other people. So Gandhi put this, Gandhi put this in his own way. He said the key, when he was asked by the British, someone was questioning, what's the key? He said, the key is learning to reduce one's ego to a zero. And that led him to say, that's why I'm entitled to speak for the Indian masses, because I see everything in terms of service. That's the life breath of living on this earth. If we can reduce to any degree the ego of the self and make it small when moments are big, then a great deal of good can happen. The one contemporary writer put it in terms of unselfing the mind. It's a phrase also that Joe Miller uses periodically that I find very beautiful and very insightful. Unselfing the mind. It's something worth contemplating and thinking about, because everything requires some thought, some reflection. No reflex thoughts, but thoughtful thought, considering what it means. Well, given this, what does our tumultuous world need now and the future? Do we need another Gandhi? If so, in what sense do we need another Gandhi? Well, that leads us to an interesting point. It's hard sometimes to see through, to kind of see through the filters of history beyond statues and beyond photographic images of Gandhi. It's hard to see kind of the vitalizing, living Gandhi. This is always a challenge to people, I'm sure, who are scholars, however devoted. How do you really picture with the mind's eye, in a living, dynamic way, someone like this who had so many marvelous virtues and also had his flaws? Certainly had his flaws. Well, Louis Fisher, a wonderful journalist who visited Gandhi twice, for 1 week in 1942 and for 3 weeks in 1946, doing some really critical periods of time. And he actually lived with Gandhi in his ashram and followed him around. And he raised the question to himself, which is rather important. Why did Gandhi have such immense moral authority, an ability to inspire others to courageously invoke their better selves and to suffer for it? So I'll read you his answer because it's so insightful and eloquent that I would only want to do it that way. Here's what he surmises after spending time with Gandhi, walking in the fields, where he said, by the way, walking with Gandhi at 5:30 in the morning is an interesting enterprise. Just as light is dawning, and you're walking across the fields, and what you find is Gandhi, you realize in time, he's so translucent, so transparent. He thinks, and when he thinks, you see beyond his words. You realize you're in the presence of someone who's sharing thoughts, intimate thoughts, but sharing them freely, and they're creative thoughts. And pretty soon you're pulled into his stream of thinking. You see him searching, yearning, looking for solutions to deep human problems, for political problems, social problems, trying to get clarity, making connections, and then turning suddenly and saying something witty, something humorous, something that dispels any overly somberness, overly seriousness. At the same time, he's deeply serious. He had an incredible rhythm in his ashram, but at the same time, he could focus on an issue and also be humorous. Fisher said to him, when Gandhi first saw Fisher, when he saw him for the second time, he took a hold of Fisher's arm. He said, well, Fisher, welcome back. It's been 4 years, and clearly I'm no less uglier than I was before. And Fisher looked at him with Bambi eyes and said, well, I would dare not argue with you. So he had quite a versatile mind, heart. And here's what Fisher says. Gandhi's On the Earth simplicity, devoid of the appearances or reality of power, emphasized his authority. The omnipotent dictator is least likely to have any authority. Gandhi had no power to compel, to punish, or reward. His power was nil, his authority enormous. It came of love. Living with him, one could see why he was loved. He loved. Not merely in isolated incidents, but day in and day out, morning, noon, and night, for decades, in every act and word. He had manifested his love of individuals and of mankind. Nor could one fail to notice in such a sentence and attitude, in each sentence and attitude, his lifelong loyalty to a few simple, widely founded principles. An exaltation of means over ends, nonviolence, the primacy of truth, the curing qualities of trust and consideration for the other's doubts, time lag, environment, and inner conflicts. He faced each day's issues in the light of eternal and universal values. By going to the ethical heart of a practical problem and sloughing off superficial considerations, he found the permanent nucleus in the ephemeral. It enabled him to split the social atom and find a new source of energy in the masses. Some had written and spoken well, as he, or better. Gandhi's greatness lay in doing what others might do, but don't. One sat in wonder before the miracle, for it apparently was an effortless way of life rather than a conscious program. Now, in a sense, when you get this sense of Gandhi about his incredible capacity to be simple and to handle the complex, to be gracious as well as frank, to combine what seem to be to us competing qualities, or qualities that have tension in the human being, he kind of challenges us to look at him afresh. I think one thing that's important, if we're thinking in terms of, do we need another Gandhi, it's important for us to realize that Gandhi's virtues and limitations were not unique. They are present in everyone to some degree. If Gandhi refused to put himself on a pedestal, so should we. That does not mean we subtract from his dignity or his achievements, not at all. But it's important to take responsibility that what you admire and what you admire, you should attempt to emulate. Isn't that what we do with children? We hold up before children fine examples. We want them to emulate them, not just to admire them. That's true with Gandhi as well. After all, he was adept at self-correction. He continually learned from his mistakes as well as from the things that he did correctly. I'm reminded here of a comment made by the Dalai Lama. He said, when you lose, don't lose the lesson. Okay? When you lose, don't lose the lesson. Gandhi was wonderful at this. He was not concerned principally with winning and losing, but he recognizes in a relative world that's true. That's the case. We should also be wary of Gandhianism, because imitating Gandhi is not the same thing as emulating Gandhi and making him relevant to our own world. I think, too, the question about do we need another Gandhi is a bit misleading when I think about it, because really what we need is multiple myriad Gandhis in every village and in every urban area, in every countryside, and in every citadel of learning, of academia. So we need a plethora of Gandhis rather than a new Gandhi. And we need ourselves to take him more serious for our own lives. Now, what I want to do, I think is important before I go on and share something with you. For a moment, if it would be acceptable to everyone here, I'd like to say something about his principles of truth, or satya, and nonviolence, or ahimsa. I think it really makes a difference if we can grasp to some degree what Gandhi meant by truth and what he seems to have meant by nonviolence. To Gandhi's way of thinking, truth is twofold. It is both absolute and relative. Let me read you 3 quotes from Gandhi. The word truth, satya, is derived from sat, which means that which is. Satya, or truth, is a state of being. Nothing is or exists in reality except truth. That is why sat, or satya, existence or truth, is the right name for God. In fact, it is more correct to say that truth is God than to say that God is truth. It's very interesting. Truth is God. What are the implications of that? Interesting question to think about. Second quote. There should be truth in thought, truth in speech, and truth in action. How can truth be a state of mind unless we think truly and straight, and we also speak and act according to the truth that we understand? How else can a person become a truth unless they think it, feel it, speak it, and act it? That seems to follow. Then finally, where there is honest effort, it will be realized that what appears to be different truths are like the countless and apparently different leaves of the same tree. Now, let me illustrate just briefly a couple of things. Absolute truth is one and transcendent, and relative truth is multitudinous. In other words, the sun emanates multitudinous rays omnidirectionally, right? So we know the sun radiates rays of light throughout the cosmos. This is analogous to truth. Absolute truth is like the sun. Relative truths are like all the rays of light that unfold in continuous rays from the sun. Another analogy is like the ocean. The ocean and its drops. The drops of the ocean contain the power of the ocean. Or another analogy would be a ray of light refracted through a medium in which you get the spectrum of colors. The white ray is present in all of the colors. So what Gandhi seems to be indicating is that there's a sense in which truth ultimately is above and beyond every conceivable truth. Otherwise, there would be no room for growth. There would be no room for evolution. In that sense, truth is utterly egoless. Truth is also divine. You can understand why he was so respectful of other people. Why? Because everyone reflects something of the absolute truth, which is divinity. So he had an immense respect for each person's perspective and truth. Now, what to me is interesting is if absolute truth, if we posit the existence of absolute truth, which transcends every truth that exists, that lends a dignity and power to relative truth. In other words, every person's perspective has its dignity, its power, its strength to illuminate and to activate the individual's will in a world of immense diversity. So there is a power to relative truth that we should not forget. Now, nonviolence in Gandhi is both negative and positive. I'll read you what he says about the negative. In its negative form, ahimsa, nonviolence, means not injuring any living being, whether by body or mind. I may not therefore hurt the person of any wrongdoer or bear any ill will to him and so cause him mental suffering. In a positive sense, this is Gandhi again. In its positive sense, ahimsa means the largest love, the greatest charity. If I am a lover of ahimsa, I must love my enemy. I must apply the same rule to the wrongdoer, who is my enemy or a stranger to me, as I would to my wrongdoing father or son. So, nonviolence is emphasized initially rather than love, because Gandhi apparently, recognizing the will to violence, to dominance, to exploitation, is so strong in modern man, has been built into modern civilization to such a strong degree that he felt it was important for the person who seeks truth and seeks to exemplify truth and responsibility and trust in a world, that one has to kind of purge oneself. One has to negate the will to impose, to dominate, to do violence. Strangely enough, interestingly enough, when we do that, we release a larger love. We like to talk of truth and love, but Gandhi seems to be emphasizing, really, you can't release the heart fully. Everyone loves. Everyone needs to be loved. But what gets in the way of the larger love, the more expansive love, the inclusive love that allows us to entertain so many different kinds of individuals, personalities, and points of view, is the fact that somewhere we wish to impose our will upon the world. It's the wrong kind of will. So that's important to Gandhi, and of course, to do this implies suffering. To Gandhi, the solvent, the psychological alchemy, the alchemical agent, was our willingness to suffer creatively for not only the truth we believed in, but for the truth that others believed in. Not only for the good that we do, but for the wrong that others do. So it's a very challenging concept that he has. Now, lastly, before I do something else here, the notion of truth and nonviolence, these principles, have to be individuated by everyone to some degree. I think it would be true, wouldn't it, to say that every culture, community, has various civilizing centers, agencies, from parents to schools, to civic organizations, to churches, that all attempt to help us move from self-centeredness to other-centeredness, right? Isn't that basically true? Enculturating centers, socializing centers want us to do that, don't they? I mean, as a child, when we're born, aren't we self-centered? Not selfish, self-centered. It's not until you're self-aware that you can talk about being selfish. Children are not selfish. Their behavior might be selfish from an adult's point of view, but until they emerge into self-awareness and have the capacity to reason and to choose, we can't really meaningfully speak of them as being selfish or unselfish. They might reflect these qualities, but they're not consciously so. So it seems like the community, through parents, through schools, through a variety of agencies, want to welcome us and to help us get into the world, so to speak, to see ourselves as living with other human beings in very interesting relationships that are either nurturing or not. So, but this happens all the time in every culture. They try the attempt to help us understand that we should be contributing members of the community. And some cultures and traditional societies had particular ceremonies, right, that they did to help you go from being a child or a young adult to being an adult. There were certain ritual symbolic reenactments that occurred called the rites of passage. Often young men, males in these cultures, had to show that they could perform certain tasks. Usually they had to involve some kind of courage or endurance or persistence. Women in Native American tribes, for example, there was a solemn ceremony to honor the beginning of womanhood, of puberty, of your menstrual cycle. I remember once when my wife and I were at an exhibit, and we were looking at these wonderful paintings done of Native American cultures. And we came to one painting, and there was just an exquisite portrait of a young woman in her ceremony honoring the fact that she had now become a woman, and her grandmother and her mother were present. And the look on her face of solemnity, of dignity, the smile of sweetness on the grandmother's face, understanding what was transpiring and what she would be facing, and the mother's attempt to explain something to her about what she faced in the future as she grew into womanhood and citizenship in the village. It spoke volumes with very little being said, because the painter had done an exquisite job of embodying the meaning that he intended in the painting. So in most places and cultures, there's some way of helping us to understand that part of developing and growing is becoming members of a civil community. But we often don't have exacting standards of what it means to be intellectually, morally, and spiritually mature. Gandhi, however, certainly had those standards. He wanted us to individuate. He encouraged everyone, be true, and don't simply fall prey to the notion that to be a true individual is simply to have the right beliefs. This is one of the fallacies of limited religion. It's also one of the fallacies of reformers. Simply having the correct beliefs is not sufficient. You might be a decent human being. You might be someone who fulfills your obligations. That's fine. But that's not necessarily the same thing as having individuated in a deeper sense that Gandhi intended and hoped for. Now, having said that, clearly Gandhi was exemplary in terms of bringing together truth and nonviolence in a way that allowed him to gestate whole new modalities of living and of improving self as well as the community. We know, for example, just to mention some of the things that he developed in South Africa and refined later in India, the taking of vows, the cultivating of individual patterns of living based on truth and nonviolence, fasting for self-purification, economic boycotts of goods, non-cooperation with injustice, civil obedience or satyagraha, and founding intentional communities. Now, before I go on and mention a few last things and open it up, I want to make one other point about what the individual is to Gandhi. To Gandhi, you individuate. When you make a solemn resolve, or even take a vow, to seek truth and to act nonviolently, regardless of the cost. That, I think, is critical. The difference between an academic or a scholar and a practitioner is an academic can investigate and explore different intellectual concepts and developments, but is not necessarily committed. A practitioner differs from the scholar in that the practitioner makes a wholehearted commitment to following a certain perspective or certain truth and attempting to practice it. It does not make the practitioner incapable of understanding other points of view at all. But it does mean that there is a wholehearted commitment to the truth that they perceive as being the most vital and important, and to living it out. So this involves a kind of waking up. Now, what I thought I would do, I want to actually do something that Robert brought up at the last meeting where we saw the Gandhi film. Remember the documentary on Gandhi, the black and white documentary, as people refer to it, where we got to see Gandhi moving very quickly across the screen, and everybody seeming to walk with great vigor. But Robert kept raising the question, well, gee, you know, truth, yes. Principle, yes. Nonviolence, yes. But how do we correlate this with American culture, with our contemporary time, right? Now, for a while I thought, well, what I'll do is I'm going to talk a bit about Satyagraha in South Africa. This is where he forged everything, really, was in South Africa. This is where he went through transformations. This is where he himself changed and began to change the modalities that the world was beginning to witness of a new way of dealing with social inequality, with injustices, with every kind of violence you can think of. And therefore, when he went to India, he was able then to continue the momentum he had established in South Africa and to refine it and to develop it further within the Indian subcontinent, the Indian context. Nonetheless, it is an interesting question to think of, well, what kind of correlations can we make with Gandhian thought, with Gandhian principles, once we see that what Gandhi is talking about is really universal? If you assume for a moment, like Einstein was willing to do, that truth is boundless, that we've just touched the surface of all the truths that we can realize. But more importantly, even the truths we do have such a profundity, depth, and oceanic depth to them that we have yet to really explore them and exemplify them to the fullest degree. If that's the case, then how can we take Gandhi's views and see them in relation to American culture? Well, before I do that, before I talk, because even though I have thoughts in relation to many different orbits of American culture, I thought that perhaps what I would do is make some suggestions in relation to, quote, the family, and then move from there to that dangerous dimension called politics, okay? And the hyphen in between, of course, is the social. But before I do that, I want to genuinely ask if you have any questions in relation to the Gandhian principles of truth and nonviolence before we go any further. And then I'm going to limit it for just a few minutes because I do want to talk about these other correlations and have us comment on those. Yes, Jay?
I heard the term nonviolence used many times. I never heard the word peace. And love, free, actually the word free originally meant love. And I had a similar experience to Gandhi living in the South Pacific, Polynesians. And it was interesting that in the beginning they mentioned the Olympics, because 2,000 years ago, Tacitus, the Roman senator, says, oh, the people are really fools. They love these games we're teaching them. They don't realize we're training them to be our warriors. We are an extremely violent nation now, as competition is the very basis, the core of our society. And living with the Polynesians, we wouldn't play any games. Say, why would I want to beat somebody? That's not very nice. You know? But it's very much that love, the real essence of love, is allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, to be really truthfully to ourselves and giving to each other and helping each other and that sort of thing.
Well, to Gandhi, I mean, who doesn't wish peace? That's for sure. But he seemed to be someone who was a karma yogan. And so for him, a peaceful condition is a static condition. And the world is not static. The world is kinetic and dynamic. And therefore, even with the best of intentions and the best principles by which we found our institutions, including our marvelous Declaration of Independence, which has such marvelous principles in it, the spirit of it can be lost so quickly, as it has been in America, certainly. So Gandhi, recognizing the entropy, the gravitational pull of human nature and of human society, wanted us to be ever vigilant and ever alert. Because peaceful conditions, which we all desire, are never going to be static. There's always going to be change, subtle or otherwise. So while we seek to have harmony and peace, we have to be ever vigilant, because human nature is such that the self can arise at any moment. And furthermore, institutionals consolidate and get conservative. This happens, you conserve the good, but nonetheless, in time, it narrows and constricts. And I'd also mention about the Olympics. The Olympics go back, of course, to ancient Greece. And in the original Olympics, as I understood it, as a non-scholar, is that the Olympic Games, you won a what? You won a wreath from the Games. You came back to your city and you were celebrated by your city because you displayed excellence. And you won an honor for your whole city. And in fact, if you were an Olympic hero, you received certain benefits from the community in time, because it goes back many centuries to the 7th or 8th century BCE. In fact, Socrates wicked off the assembly that was trying him, because after being judged to be guilty, he was allowed to propose his own penalty. And he said, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a benefactor of Athens, and I have served you well for 6 decades. So as far as I'm concerned, you should treat me as an Olympic hero, and therefore I should have free meals at the gymnasium. Well, this did not settle well with the assembly, in addition to other things, but it's a reference to the fact that the Olympics are that way. Yes, any other question? Or
I have a question. How would you describe the truths that follow? What are the truths?
how would you describe? How would you what?
How would you describe the truths that Gandhi spoke of?
Well, describe the truths. Well, he believed in many truths, what we would call to be an ideal. He believed in the importance of human justice. And the importance of equitability. For example, he refused to honor caste within his ashram. These are social distinctions that we make. Interestingly enough, he believed that the 4 orders of Hindu society, of the different caste levels, from the Brahmin to the Sudra, he felt that they were functions that occur in every society, but they should not be seen as entitlements that entitle people to certain privileges. It's what you do to Gandhi that matters. So there are a number of truths that he would believe in. It would just depend on what you're talking, whether you're talking about political truths or what. But there were a number of truths that Gandhi believed in. His point was there should be certain primary ethical truths that are found in all religion and the basis of all civilization. That there should be justice and equality and freedom. Those are very common truths, very universal truths. There should be unity and diversity as well as another truth of Gandhi. Other questions? Yes.
Would this be time for question, or you want to hold comments till after?
Okay.
You want to hold comments till after?
No, that's fine.
Well, I was
if it's
thinking-
relevant to this, yes.
In a society that has its institutions and organizations to try to socialize its members to common ideas,
Right.
still there has to be the freedom for the individual to make his own experiments, to find out truth in his own way. And so, well, I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but I think in the end the discovery of truth is an individual
It is.
feedback thing.
Well, ultimately, as one understands it, truth is clearly individually realized. No one can realize the truth for anyone else, any truth for anyone else, really. We do have teachers. Teachers matter. Teachers make it possible for us to become aware of truths and to have some understanding of them. But you can't really teach truth. That has to be discovered through your own thought, search, and experiments, as you say. But nonetheless, every culture has to have its contours, has to have its parameters. Furthermore, cultures develop modalities of helping people to learn and to instantiate truths, form different forms of justice, different forms of responsibility, different forms of affection and concern, how to deal with different things from birth to marriage to illness to death. How do you take care of those who are dispossessed? How do you deal with those who are elderly? How do you deal with those who are ill? How do you deal with those who have been the victims of violence? All of these modalities tell you something about, give you an index of the quality of the culture. They do leave room for initiative. There has to be initiative. But it's nonetheless, even though we can only discover truth individually, we benefit immensely from interacting and engaging other people in constructive ways. Part of the point that Gandhi was making about truth being multiple, about respecting different perceptions of truth, is because when you and I have a truth, it's not really as clear to us until we engage other minds and hearts in a discussion of it, and furthermore in an exemplification of it. It's hard to see ourselves the way other people see us. You can't do it by looking in a mirror, right? We often look in a mirror, but we see, quote, what we think is ourselves. We don't see ourselves the way other people see us. We're myopic. So when we witness the world, when we read history, when we see the unfolding of events with our own eyes, so to speak, it teaches us. And not until you're challenged do you really understand what you believe. And not until you scan your own actions on a nightly basis, like Pythagoras insists, do we have any clear understanding of how we really function in the world. Because Pythagoras said, if you really want to understand yourself and the world, make it a point every evening before you go to sleep to review your daily activities through a microscope. And don't do it once, do it 3 times. Because you edit the first time. Look 3 times. And as you scan the days and you look at what you did and look at other people that are within your circumference of interaction, you will begin to understand things about yourself and about them. You will discern patterns. You will discern attitudes. You will see the things that they treasure that you didn't recognize. You will see how subtly you hurt feelings that you didn't mean to hurt. You will see how you were a little arrogant when you didn't mean to be arrogant. You didn't realize this is built into your very language, to your tonality, to your gestures, to your speech. So you go through this incredible sifting process at night, and what you're doing is refining the self and refining your understanding of the selves around you. And so your truth is beginning to become more transparent, more luminous as you begin to do that. So all of life is a school, all of life is an experiment, and we're learning from each other all the time. If we didn't have that, as Gandhi said, it's very, very difficult to achieve enlightenment in a cave. It is possible, in theory, for someone to be so highly developed and wise to be able to sit in a cave and to benefit the world. That is true. He did not deny that. But he said for the 99%, here's his 99%, for the 99% of us, the rest of us, we need to both reflect, think, and to engage. Intellectually, morally, and otherwise, yes.
What attitude did he have regarding defense in the face of violence? I mean, did he deal with that at all? I don't remember ever hearing anybody mention that. I'm not a scholar.
You mean defense in the
Well, I'm just saying,
Yeah, right.
I mean, you start out by
Self-defense.
saying, self-sacrifice,
Yeah.
is the ultimate sacrifice. But, I mean, certainly he didn't believe in not defending yourself in the face of destruction by others or an animal or what have you.
Now you're, Ernie's opened up the question that Gandhi said. He said, when it comes to nonviolence, we in the ashram who are committed to truth and nonviolence, the most difficult discussions, the most divisive discussions were over what is a nonviolent action. That was where the shoe really pinched. Now, let me mention a few things. In his own personal life, Gandhi was, within a day of arriving in South Africa at the age of 22, he was thrown off a train. On the second day, third day, they attempted to beat him because he didn't want to sit up next to the driver in the stagecoach. He wanted to sit inside the stagecoach with everyone else. In neither case did he fight back physically. Later on, when he was engaged in satyagraha campaigns between 1906 and 1914, he was attacked by a Panthan who was an Indian, but who disagreed with Gandhi's decision to suspend satyagraha campaign. So he laid way for him and he beat him badly. Gandhi did not resist, but what's more importantly, he didn't file charges. When he got off the boat in South Africa, in Durban, in the province of Natal, there was a group of men waiting for him on the dock. When he came off, they attacked him. And I'm pretty convinced he would have died. Why didn't he die? First of all, he didn't fight back. But the wife of the chief of police of Durban happened to be passing by. And she saw them beating Gandhi. And so she came very bravely and jumped right in front of Gandhi with her umbrella and said, "Don't you hit this man again." And she opened her umbrella to protect Gandhi. And she stepped in front of him. And they recognized, oh, this is the constable's wife. So they kind of backed away. Actually, they pursued him to his house. They were going to burn down the house, everything. He managed to escape, but he never filed charges. So personally, that was he took it down to the level even of non-physical resistance and self-defense. But he also said, I believe in nonviolence, beginning at the level of your intent. To Gandhi, nonviolence begins with your will, your intent. It's not physical. It's actually in terms of your motive and your intent. But it includes the physical if you're really very disciplined, which Gandhi was. So that when his son said to him, Father, that man tried to kill you. Someone tried to assassinate him once and they failed. And Gandhi said, son said, what should I have done? And he said, well, ideally the satyagrahi would have stepped in front and taken the bullet. But Gandhi well knew that most people didn't subscribe to that or measure up to it. But he said, if you did not feel genuinely that you could do that, then you had an absolute right to do what you could to overpower him and to keep him from killing me. Because courage is infinitely greater than cowardice. Courage is infinitely greater than cowardice. And so he felt that it's much better for someone to be a soldier than it is for someone to be a passive resistor simply because you're afraid and you don't have the power. So that's why he didn't mind people recruiting for the, he himself recruited people for the World War I because he believed in the goodness of the British Empire, and he felt he had a responsibility to do that. And he got criticized for it pretty heavily. So he said, ideally, this is the ideal, but people should be genuine. He didn't think India should resist the Japanese if they came in. But when they took a position that they would, he said, fine. He understood it. When Nehru and the Indian Army went to Kashmir and Jammu to protect it, he agreed with the policy. So he would say, this is the ideal, but there are many different modes of practice. As long as you don't passively accept injustice and you engage it and make it visible and make evil visible, and then non-violently try to deal with it through courage and principle, that's the best you can do, that's fine. Yeah.
Why did he not file charges against the man?
Because he felt that they were ignorant.
Yeah, but that's, if you have the option
I understand.
to correct an injustice, you have a citizen responsibility to follow through on it.
I understand your point, but Gandhi's view of this, well, of course, he was assassinated in January of 1948, right? A few days before his assassination, one of the members of the conspiracy to assassinate him, a young man, stood by the wall near where Gandhi was having his prayer meeting and attempted to throw a bomb over the wall. Well, he threw the bomb and it didn't quite get over the wall. And he was getting ready to throw another one. Gandhi heard the blast, didn't know what it was. And an elderly lady standing by went running over and grabbed him and held him. The thing. He again said, I don't want to press charges. His firm belief was that people can be converted through trust and forgiveness, but he did also have limits. I know that's for us a stretch, but he was trying to make the point that retributive institutions perpetuate violence. They don't solve anything. If you can bring something into a prison that is more nonviolent rather than less so, then you made a step in the right direction. There's that marvelous minister who, Baptist minister, Jenny isn't here to tell the story, but he tells the story in South America in a prison, a man who was imprisoned for murder. And he was in prison with another prisoner, and they both shared the same cell. And they were really heavy dudes, and they didn't get along real well. And the prison guards didn't mind. Let them beat each other up. Less work for us. Well, the one who had committed murder was told that there was these seminars being held for prisoners, sponsored by Martin Luther King Jr. Foundation. So he finally decided out of boredom to go to one. And then he went to a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth. By the time he got through intense discussions and challenges about nonviolence, he began to feel that there was truth in this. That truth, candor, frankness, as well as some form of fellowship in reaching out to other people, made a difference. So what happened was, he is speaking to this cellmate of his one night, and it turns out that this cellmate had gone berserk because someone had killed his brother, his younger brother. And he had done a lot of melee, and he'd been in prison for it. It dawned on this prisoner, who was going to the King meetings, that he was the one that killed his brother. That was what you call a moment of choice. So he thought, in the spirit of King, in the spirit, you might say, of Gandhi, candor is important. I have to tell this man that I'm the one that killed his brother. And I have to ask myself, do I have the courage to take his anger and his expression of it or not? That's my question. And so he finally decided to tell the man that he had killed his brother. And he told him, he said, look, I'm going to tell you something. It's going to upset you, and I totally understand why you're upset. And I just want to tell you in advance, I have no excuse. I make no excuse. And if you want to do me harm, then I'm not going to resist you. And the man was looking at him like he's crazy. What are you talking about? And then he told him that he was the one that killed his brother. And the story goes that he was pushed in an explosive push to the end of the cell, hit the wall, came down, and the man stood over him, and he was confused. And then he settled down, and he went over and thought about it. And then he came back, and he extended a hand, and they shook hands, and they became friends. How peculiar. Do you know, this same minister tells a story, who was a logician for King's civil disobedience movement, this particular Baptist minister from the South. He says that he himself was called up into the hills somewhere. I think it was Bolivia, I'm not sure where. No, Colombia. He went up into the hills because a drug dealer, who was a heavy dude in that area, said he wanted to see him. He felt, I don't have much choice. I better go up into the hills. So he was taken up to the hills on a jeep. He gets there, and there's this man standing there, and he's surrounded by people with all these Uzis and everything. And so this minister says, okay, this is my moment of truth. And so he goes into this, and there's this man, this probably in his 30s, he said. And he tells all of the other people in his gang, or whatever you want to call it, to move away. And they move at a great distance. And it's just this minister and this heavy-duty mafia type of individual, Colombian. And the Baptist minister says, I have to tell you, I was totally stunned. What did he say to me? He said, I have a question. I said, yes? He said, well, first I have to tell you something. And he looks around to be sure no one else can hear them. He said, I went into the city 3 weeks ago. Even I need a vacation. And I went into the city, and there was a movie playing. And I went and saw the movie. And the movie was called Gandhi. I saw the movie. I came back up here. And now my heart is churning. I'm at war with myself. I don't know exactly what to do. But I do know I don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. I need to get out of this without these folks killing me. Do you have any suggestions? He said, thus began a very interesting conversation between these two people. So, isn't it interesting how history works?
That's the ending.
He eventually was able to free himself from his engagements with these group of people. I think he said that he went down and joined the King Fellowship that was working in Colombia at the time, because they're also working in Palestine and in Israel and elsewhere in various groups, dealing with people who have been brutalized because they were child soldiers, and they come in with 67 deaths on their soul that they try to deal with. People who are there, King people are there to meet them, to help them. Some everyday Gandhis have also done the same here in Santa Barbara. They've done some amazing work in helping to heal people who have done, atrocious things because they were too young to have a conscience and to understand what they were doing.